That said, because it is Friday, if we're being honest, because it is a day that ends in Y in this era, there is a lot of news, including late-breaking news tonight, coming out of Washington as well. In terms of the Washington news tonight, I need to tell you a story that starts with Bill Clinton, who went to college at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Bill Clinton, as a young man, got there as an undergraduate in 1964. He graduated in 1968. And one of the stories about Bill Clinton's college career ends up being sort of relevant tonight to what we've just learned in Washington. Legend has long had it, that at some time during Bill Clinton's early college years, when he was at Georgetown, when he was a young man, maybe when he was about 19, so maybe when he was a freshman, young Bill Clinton went to a party in Massachusetts that was a beach party. And political legend has it that at that beach party, he was swimming in the ocean, and he basically got grabbed by a riptide and started to get pulled out to sea. And when that happened, another young man, another 19-ish-year-old man, a Harvard student, came to his rescue. And the man who came to Bill Clinton's rescue in that possibly apocryphal near-drowning story was a man named Fife Symington. Fife Symington was a Harvard student at the time this supposedly happened. He also went on to be a very famous politician in his own right. Fife Symington was a Republican. He ended up becoming governor of Arizona. Bill Clinton, of course, was a Democrat who ended up becoming governor of Arkansas and then president of the United States. I have to tell you, I've heard this story a million times. I have always suspected that the 1960s beach party riptide Fife Symington Bill Clinton rescue story might be wholly or at least in part apocryphal. But I've heard it a million times. And it is one of the things that people talked about a lot years later, in 2001, at the end of Bill Clinton's time in office, when he issued, surprise, a presidential pardon to Fife Symington, the guy who maybe saved him from drowning all those decades earlier. In 1997, Fife Symington had been convicted of 7 felonies related to his business life as a commercial real estate developer. Fife Symington was charged with a whole raft of corruption charges. He was ultimately convicted of filing false financial statements. Basically, he was convicted of bank fraud. Ultimately, down the road, an appeals court would overturn his convictions. And then later in 2001, he would get a presidential pardon from bad swimmer Bill Clinton. But when that case was brought, when those convictions happened, that was a big, traumatic legal case in the country broadly, but obviously specifically for Fife Symington. He was a very popular figure in Republican politics. People were looking at him as a person of potential presidential timber. Those convictions in 1997 forced him out of office immediately as Arizona governor and ultimately ended his political career. His lawyer, as he went through that trauma and those convictions, was a guy named John Dowd. John Dowd also represented, I should tell you, Arizona Senator John McCain in the Keating 5 scandal. John McCain called his own involvement in that corruption scandal, quote, the worst mistake of my life. John McCain politically survived that scandal. He ultimately did not get criminally charged like a lot of other people did. He didn't get thrown out of Congress for his involvement in it, but it was bad for John McCain. The Ethics Committee in the Senate ripped him for his involvement in that scandal. They ripped him for his poor judgment. They basically said the only reason they didn't go after him further for some of his own financial entanglements in that scandal was because McCain was in the House at the time he did those things, and the Senate Ethics Committee didn't feel like they had jurisdiction over him for his wrongdoing when he was just a member of the House of Representatives instead of the Senate. So John McCain survived the Keating 5 scandal, but by the skin of his teeth. And his lawyer in that matter was the Fife Symington guy. It was this guy, John Dowd. John Dowd is also famous for this case from 2011. This is a case that went very badly. I will just read you the lead sentence from the New York Times report on this case the day the ruling came down. Quote, the fallen hedge fund billionaire Raj Rajaratnam received the longest prison sentence ever for insider trading on Thursday. That fallen hedge fund billionaire, his lawyer, when he got the longest prison sentence ever for insider trading, his lawyer was John Dowd. John Dowd, Fife Symington, John Dowd, John McCain, John Dowd, longest insider trading prison sentence ever. And that same lawyer, John Dowd, is now going to be Donald Trump's new lawyer. President Trump had reportedly had a hard time finding name-brand D.C. lawyers and D.C. law firms to represent him in the ongoing investigations into the Russian attacks on the presidential campaign last year and the question of whether or not his campaign might have helped in that Russian attack. Those investigations have now also reportedly expanded to include potential obstruction of justice by the president himself and maybe by other people in his administration. That resistance from big D.C. lawyers and big D.C. law firms, him calling them, looking for representation, and firm after firm telling him no, that has meant that the president's legal team, as he has assembled his legal team for these scandals, has been a little unorthodox for somebody who is facing scandals as serious as the ones this president is facing. The first lawyer he signed up, famously, was a lawyer named Mark Kasowitz. He's a lawyer who has done things like real estate law and divorce law for the president in the past, but he has never done anything like any of the Washington legal trouble that the president finds himself in now. In addition to Mark Kasowitz, we also got indirect notice that the president had signed up a notable litigator from the religious right. A guy who started off representing televangelists, a guy who does cases about, like, displaying the Ten Commandments and stuff like that. He's a very good lawyer, but he's known for a very specific kind of law. We got indirect notice that the president had also signed up Jay Sekulow to his legal team when Mr. Sekulow started appearing on TV shows defending the president and speaking for him, apparently as one of his private lawyers. That's the way we found out he got that job. Well, now, to that unlikely presidential legal team, the president has apparently today added John Dowd, who at least he has been involved in some high-profile political scandals in the past. And Mr. Dowd is well regarded in his field, even though some of the stuff he is most famous for is stuff where his clients did not come out all that well at all. This team of lawyers that the president is putting together to defend him in his various scandals, this, of course, is a team that the president will end up paying for himself, or at least we, the taxpayers, won't end up paying for those lawyers. These are private lawyers who are totally separate and apart from the official White House counsel, whose salary we do pay. I imagine, though, that the matter of paying for his private lawyers is like the least concerning element of all of this for President Trump, right? If only because he is so personally wealthy. We got a reminder of, and a lot more detail about the extent of his personal wealth today when the White House released new financial disclosure forms for the president himself. We'll be talking about those a little bit more later on in this hour. But I have to tell you, as we got that new evidence of the president's wealth and we got new news about the president adding to his legal team, we also, just in the past 24 hours, got news that another senior member of the administration, someone who is not wealthy at all, has also just hired himself a top-dollar, very well-regarded lawyer to represent him in these ongoing scandals. And right now, as we speak, Vice President Mike Pence, who just hired that new expensive lawyer, he's back home in Indiana tonight. And specifically, he's at the Marriott Hotel in downtown Indianapolis because he is holding a fundraiser there. Interesting, though, Mike Pence tonight is not holding this fundraiser for the Republican Party. He's not holding a fundraiser for any of the subsidiary elements of the Republican Party, like its Senate campaign fund or its House campaign fund. He's not holding a fundraiser for, like, that Republican candidate in next week's congressional election in Georgia. No, it's interesting. Tonight, Vice President Mike Pence is holding that fundraiser in Indianapolis for his own political action committee, his own PAC. Never before in the history of the country has a vice president set up and operated his own political action committee while he was still serving as vice president and not technically running for anything. The people attending Mike Pence's fundraiser for his PAC tonight in Indianapolis paid a lot of money to go to it, anywhere from $1,000 just to get into the reception, up to $5,000 a plate to attend something they're calling the Leadership Committee Roundtable, which I think is just nonsense fundraising speak for I paid more money so I could be in a smaller room. But 5 people are paying $5,000 a pop to go roundtable with Mike Pence tonight in Indiana. Now, it's unusual, full stop, that a vice president has a political action committee. But on top of that, there is now this intriguing question as to how Mike Pence is going to pay for his very expensive private lawyer, who he just announced the hiring of yesterday. I mean, this is the person who's going to defend Mike Pence and represent Mike Pence in anything having to do with the Trump-Russia scandal or the obstruction of justice investigations. This is a lawyer who gets paid a lot per hour and is probably going to be working a lot of hours. Is it possible that this fundraiser for Mike Pence's PAC tonight in Indianapolis, is it possible that's actually going to be a way for people to fund Mike Pence's legal defense? We called the vice president's spokesman tonight to ask whether the money that the vice president is raising right now tonight for his PAC, whether that money might be used in the future for Mike Pence's legal defense. The vice president's spokesperson would not really say exactly, but this is the exact response we got from him. Quote, his legal fees will be paid by non-tax dollars. Quote, that's all we are saying. We have not discussed it except to say that it is not tax dollars. That was in response to us asking if this fundraiser for his PAC tonight is going to raise money for his legal defense. It won't be tax dollars. That's all we're saying. So we don't know if that means that donations to Mike Pence's PAC are going to be used to pay his legal defense. If that's now going to be how he spends his time as vice president, doing fundraisers to pay for his lawyers. The only assurance that we have from the vice president's office is that, he's not going to have a taxpayer-funded defense, but we knew that already. He can't have a taxpayer-funded defense. I should tell you, we then tried to contact Mike Pence's PAC itself. The vice president's PAC is called the Great America Committee. There is a person who's listed on their FEC forms as the contact person for the PAC. We found that person tonight and spoke with her to find out if tonight's fundraiser might ultimately be used to fund the vice president's legal fees. She told us that she has forwarded our question to the appropriate contacts. But we don't know what that means, and we haven't heard anything further. So we'll let you know. That may be a new part of how the vice president spends his vice presidency. The vice president and his family do not have particularly deep pockets. They're going to have to raise money somehow for his legal fees. Now, whether that's already started with the creation of this PAC and this fundraiser tonight in Indianapolis, we honestly don't know. We do intend to find out. A lot of the focus on the scandal surrounding the White House has shifted this week to potential obstruction of justice, right? This week will be remembered for this blockbuster reporting that the special counsel, Robert Mueller, has now made the president the subject of an ongoing FBI criminal inquiry into whether or not there was obstruction of justice by the president to try to somehow thwart or pervert the FBI's ongoing investigations into the Russia issue. And that's a very, very big deal. But even as the media focus has shifted to that question because of that new reporting, has shifted to obstruction of justice, the original question about whether or not the Trump campaign colluded with Russia, colluded with the Russian government in the Russian attack on the election, that's still the central question. That's still at the center of the bullseye in terms of what investigators are looking at, both in Congress and at the FBI. And that came back into very sharp focus with the other big news that just broke tonight, and that's next.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.